Welcome everyone to today's devotion. We find ourselves in Matthew chapter 24, which is again one of those sermons that we find in Matthew's gospel. So we looked at one yesterday with the series of woes against the religious elites, the Pharisees and scribes. We've also looked at the kingdom parables, the Sermon on the Mount, and others. So there's most see that there's 5 major sermons in Matthew's gospel, and some find that to be a helpful outline or guideline for reading Matthew's gospel. Well, today we're looking at what's known as the Olivet Discourse, and his reason it's called the Olivet Discourse is because it took place on the Mount of Olives. Sometimes, creativity isn't man's best friend, but nevertheless, the Olivet Discourse is where Jesus speaks of the end of times. So I suspect this is going to take us a little longer than what we've been doing, but at the same time, forgive me for just skimming through a lot of things. There's so much here. It's virtually impossible for us to look at it in any great detail. I do want to go ahead and answer one question as we begin the study of the end times, and that is the coronavirus a sign of the end? Okay, I want to give you a definitive answer that may bless your heart for the rest of the day. I have absolutely no idea. Okay, with that said, we can move on. As we'll see, I think Jesus almost warns us from saying that because of X, therefore Y is the end times, right? And yes, coronavirus is a plague that is just really affecting not only our physical and medical needs, but also our economic issues, civil liberty issues. It is driving up national debt, a lot of stuff. But can we say definitively it is related to the end times? That is a question I'm not sure we can answer with any certainty, and anyone who does answer with certainty is lying to you. And that's just reality. I'm not a prophet or son of a prophet. We can only go by what the text says, and the text isn't that definitive. With that said, how is it that we interpret the Olivet Discourse, right? And there's different views of this because there's different views of the end times, okay? Let me give you the 2 big ideas in terms of interpreting the Olivet Discourse. The first is that what Jesus describes here describes the future, okay? So Jesus takes the question from the disciples. He uses it as an opportunity to prepare us for his return. Okay? That is perhaps the more prominent interpretation of this passage. The other interpretation is that Jesus is talking only about the destruction of the temple. Okay? So when the disciples marvel at the temple in verse 1, Jesus says, look, don't marvel too much because this thing is coming down. Not a stone will be left. And then he goes in to talk about birth pangs and the signs of the end. Thus for that preterist view is that Jesus is only talking about an event that has already happened in history. Okay? Now, which one do I think is right? Actually, I think both are right. I think Jesus swims between these 2 events. So I do believe there is and both events are future. So he is talking about the future. One is an immediate future, that is the destruction of the temple. The other is an ultimate future, that is the return of Christ. This is typical of prophecy in the Bible. We want prophecy to have one interpretation. That's not the case typically. If you read the very end of the Old Testament, there in Malachi, you'll see that it prophesies the coming of Elijah. And I believe, and I think Jesus picks up on that when you read Malachi, it's clearly eschatological. It's clearly about the end times. Yet Jesus shows us that John the Baptist is a fulfillment of that. So which is true? Is John the Baptist a fulfillment of Malachi 5, or is it something that happens in the end times? I think the answer is again both. You could do this with the incarnation of Jesus, right? Isaiah 7 speaks of a woman who will give birth to a child, Emmanuel, all that sort of stuff. I believe that there is an immediate fulfillment with some of the challenges that come in that text, and an ultimate fulfillment which is found in Jesus. So too, I think Jesus is in that line of prophets that when he speaks, there is an immediate fulfillment, the destruction of the temple, and an ultimate fulfillment, his second coming. And with that said, that makes the actual application of the interpretation of this passage difficult. But I do think that we can grasp some real points of application from this. The main thing I think we need to see here is that the reason studying the end times matters, although we can at times take it farther than what the text will take it, it matters because when we understand what Jesus describes here, it should cultivate faith, it should cultivate hope, and it should cultivate perseverance, especially amid suffering. Many people who get so excited about the end times, and I've been down that train for sure, we miss that to live in the end times is to live amid suffering. But that is not reason to despair. Rather, what Jesus gives us is the answers that will provide for us the hope, the faith, and the perseverance necessary to persevere through these challenging times. So let me just summarize, first of all, the signs. This is verses 1 through 28, the signs of what Jesus is describing here. He describes them as birth pangs, right? You ever had Braxton Hicks? We went through that with our second child, and the signs were there, and we knew the moment was near, and Braxton Hicks makes you long for that moment even more. Well, here are the signs. First of all, apostasy, verses 4 to 6. See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. But of course, they're not. Violence, verses 7 and 8. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Disasters, famines, and earthquakes will be in various places. And all these are the beginning of birth pangs. Persecution, verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death. You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Right? You remember that what Jesus is describing here, if you want to live in the end times, it is not a great world in which to live in, particularly as a believer. Injustice, verses 12, 13, lawlessness will increase, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. But then there is this note, verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, that is an important detail. For some, I may be trying to read too much into what Jesus says. That what I want us to see is that suffering does not negate the work and providence of God. Some try to look at the issue of suffering and say, see, God doesn't love us, or there isn't a God there to love us. We're on our own. But if we're reading the text rightly, one of the things that we can see is that suffering does not mitigate the presence, the power, and the providence of God. It doesn't. Rather, we need to see that yes, suffering is an unfortunate reality of living in a fallen world. Yet, God uses suffering for his own end that will result in his glory. So it's striking that amid all of that suffering we see with lawlessness and apostasy and disaster, what we have is the work of God in saving souls. And we really need to hear that now amid lockdown, don't we? That lockdown doesn't disprove God, nor does it mean God has abandoned us or that we're on our own, but rather it is an opportunity for us to grow in Christ. But then he talks about the abomination of desolation, verses 15 to 28. And this is a real challenging text to interpret correctly. What he means there, you see verse 15, when you see the abomination desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What is the abomination desolation? Well, you need to remember that Jesus obviously is quoting from Daniel. Daniel speaks of this, the abomination that causes desolation. So Daniel's looking forward. And Daniel uses, or Daniel is prophesying that the temple will itself be desolated. It will be desecrated. Now, this event had already happened by the time of Jesus. After the Persians are gone, right? The Greeks are replaced the Persians in dominating Israel, and because of Alexander the Great. Well, Alexander the Great dies without an heir, and so his kingdom is broken down into four states, if you will. All right, so you got four different parts of the Greek Empire following Alexander the Great, and the guy in charge of the the Israel's portion of it. Israel's part of his section. He walked into the temple, sacrificed a pig, thus desecrating the temple of God. That is the immediate fulfillment of what Daniel speaks of. Right? Now that Jesus is picking up on that language, everyone knew the desolation had already taken place with Antiochus. But Jesus says another one's going to take place. All right? And again, now we have to say, is Jesus saying that there's going to be a second one, or that Jesus is saying look for an immediate and an ultimate one? I don't know the answer to that question, right? And maybe you can see my seminary degrees in the backdrop. Now you can, all right? So I don't know the answer to that question. But I think at the very least, this is a reference to the destruction of the temple, which took place under General Titus, who eventually becomes Caesar, in AD 70, right? So I believe that's part of what Jesus describes here. It could also mean, yes, maybe there will be a future temple in Israel that's more of the dispensationalist view, and that it will be desecrated by the Antichrist, right? That is, if you've read Left Behind, you're familiar with that story. Nikolai Carpathia, the name of the Antichrist in that series, he comes in and he desecrates the temple at the 3.5 year period after the rapture, right? And that leads to an increase. I don't know if we can be that specific, but at the very least, I believe this is a reference to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. If it's a reference to another future event, perhaps that is the case. I'm going to remain agnostic regarding it. Notice what he says, verse 27, "For as the lightning comes from east and shines as far as the west, so will be the Son of Man." Right? So the Abomination of Desolation is a key sign of Christ's coming. So what do we do with this? Yes, there is the hope amid suffering, but Jesus takes this beyond that. You'll notice starting in verse 29, he tells us that those are the signs, we in the meantime need to be ready for the return of Christ. We need to wait with both patience and anxiously, right? So we wait with patience and we wait anxiously. And so he tells us to be ready because Christ is coming. And starting in verse 32, he gives us the lesson of the fig tree. Now we saw a fig tree earlier at the cursing of the fig tree, but this is a little different. Verse 33, he says that you know the signs of when you see these signs on a fig tree, you know that summer is near. So also verse 33, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. So verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. In other words, that when you see the fig tree beginning to bloom and the leaves are coming on, we talked about that a few days ago, so too, when you see these birth pangs, when you see these signs, be ready. So the Christian is always to be ready for the end while serving faithfully right now, right? To be ready for the end is to live a life of godliness and faithfulness, waiting anxiously for that coming, right? So to wait until the end doesn't mean you go out and buy a white robe and sit at the top of the hill because you've done your calculations. That is not what Jesus talked about. What he says is live a life of faithfulness, knowing that your hope is not here, it is with Christ. And the day will come when Christ will return. He will renew the heavens and the earth, and that we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is our longing, not for anything in this world. And that is why faith is so important amid lockdown, because our longings are not for a growing economy, though we want that. It's not our deepest desire. Our deepest desire isn't for our guy to be in office. Our deepest desire isn't for X, Y, or Z. Our deepest desire is that Christ would rule and reign in the hearts of men, and that we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is our deepest desire. So whether we're in lockdown or we're out roaming the streets with great freedom, our hope is in Jesus. Well, that leads to perhaps the most ignored verse in the Bible, particularly when it comes to Jesus, and that is verse 36. Concerning that day, whether he's referring exclusively to the destruction of the temple or a future event of his return, or both, regarding that day and hour, no one knows. No one knows. Therefore, verse 42, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is returning. Verse 44, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So what is the point? Be ready, because you do not know when he's returning. So that means no matter what sort of math you've got figured out because you've been reading Daniel and all those beasts and everything else, whatever answer you come up with, you do not know when Jesus is coming back. During this lockdown, I've been reading a lot, and as one of the things I've enjoyed about lockdown is the extra time I have to read. I've been reading a lot of fun histories, presidential histories, American histories, church histories, whatnot. And one of them was a book that included the narrative of the Millerites. William Miller was reading Daniel and the Olivet Discourse, and he figured out the math of when Jesus was going to return. And so he said, I believe it was 1844. And well, he got all these followers, and they came, and guess what? Jesus didn't return. And then he redid the math. He discovered he was a year or two off, reset a date. Guess what? Jesus didn't return. I mean, people would put up signs in their, the Millerites would put up signs in their shops saying, after this date, you all can have whatever you want in my shop, right? I mean, it was crazy. After that comes, by the way, the Millerites eventually becomes the Seventh-day Adventist. And now they're not as big on end times as they were then, but that's where that movement comes from. After them came the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were rooted primarily in three doctrines. One, Christ is not the eternal one with the Father. They deny the Trinity. Secondly, therefore Christ is a created being. That's a big part of what they hold to. Secondly, is a rejection of hell. They believe in annihilationism. Thirdly is Jesus is coming back soon. And they are very much part of those end-time cults that launched out of the burned down district in New York in the mid-19th century, and really believe Jesus is coming back soon. And you can find, you can read the things they published all the way back then. And to this day, they claim Jesus returned spiritually. I believe it's 1914. I can have that date wrong. And they've, when I lived in the parsonage of Breckenridge County, we had some JWs come and try to explain to me that Jesus had already come back spiritually. I remember saying, what you're going to do, you're going to open up Daniel and Olivet Discourse. You're going to show me Woodrow Wilson at World War I. Oh yeah. No, they didn't, right? They originally thought Jesus was going to return physically. He didn't, so they had to change it and say he was going to return spiritually. More recently, was it 2012? Was it a March or May that year? The guy, went around saying the end's coming, and the date came, and Jesus didn't show up. Harold something, I can't think of his name. Well, this stuff has been around forever, and it's like we don't learn our lesson. The point is not to pick and choose a date to predict when Jesus is coming back. The point is that we will be ready. We will be ready, and we long for the day that Jesus will return. And may he come quickly, especially before the 2020 election. Amen? All right. Lord willing, we'll see you guys here tomorrow. We'll conclude the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 25.